Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Donald Trump says he's made huge accomplishments since he took office, but just how healthy, how strong, and how united are the United States of America today? Let's get to the bottom line. This week, President Trump lays out his achievements in the annual State of the Union address. It's sort of like an annual health checkup at the doctor's office. In Trump world, everything is rosy. We have prosperity, lots of new jobs and lower taxes. We're getting a big, beautiful wall to block migrants. His words, not mine. As part of his culture war, all American policies, foreign and domestic, are changing really fast. For his critics, they don't recognize America anymore. Where is the America of greater racial inclusion? Where's the concern for those working full-time but still in poverty, and the rich getting richer at the expense of the rest of society? They see an America where policy changes by decree instead of by debate, and no one cares about the rule of law. So which America is it? Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have all the answers. Dr. Nyambi Carter, who teaches political science at Howard University and is the author of American While Black: African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. Dina Bass-Williams, a former Trump administration official who is currently a partner in the consultancy firm Bass Public Affairs. And Shali Gupta-Barnes, the policy director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, and one of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign across the United States. Dina, let me start with you and just ask, if you were to, be the doctor, taking the temperature of America today, what are the areas of concern you would have?
I think the greatest area of concern for me is the great division that still exists in America. We continue to talk about the rhetoric from the left and the rhetoric from the right, but I think that America is growing increasingly more divided. And
but divided in which ways?
I think that we have suited up red and blue, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives. And at the end of the day, I really believe that most Americans want healthy communities, safe communities. I think we want the same thing, but I think our avenues of getting there are different. But I think that we are becoming even more toxic in the way we address each other, and that does come from the top. And I am a conservative, I'm a Republican, and I support this president, but I do believe that there's some language and tone from the president, but also from leaders on the left that we need to, that needs to be reconciled. I will say that, even saying that, I will also say that there was a time when the sitting vice president in a duel killed the former Secretary of the Treasury. So we always say that this is the most divisive time in America, right? But we have overcome these times, and I think that we have to rally and ignore selective outrage and call what is bad, bad, and call what is good,
let me ask
good.
you, we're just going through a period where impeachment is coming to a close, and impeachment is a very serious activity, challenging whether or not the President of the United States should remain in office or not. We come through that. What would you suggest, just given what you shared, which I agree with you, we have a toxic situation, we have a lot of divide. I think it's more than tone myself, but what would you recommend as ways forward given the toxicity in our society today?
At Bass Public Affairs, we talk about attacking policy, not people. And I think that when we come together and have real conversations about policy, and we can disagree on policy, and I think that I probably disagree with some of the women on the panel about some of the policies, but I would never, ever disagree with these women about their passion for their community, passion for my community, right? So I think that we have to, I as a conservative Republican, I have to be able to plant my feet, and when the president is wrong and when his behavior is wrong, I have to say so. But I also have to recognize that I am a conservative, and he is delivering on some things that I believe that if he were a Democrat or if he were a liberal, the economy would be soaring and we'd be praising him for it. I'm one of those old-fashioned social conservatives. He was the first president to, the first sitting president to speak at the March for Life, and that was important to me. So he's delivering on some of his social conservative promises, which some of, you may disagree with those issues, but don't but attack the policy and not the person.
Shali, as I listen to Dina, and I think about the divides that are just flowing through my mind, and I travel around the country and I see lots of different ways. As you just said, you can divide up different people, not only in two corners, but maybe 5 or 6, lots of shades of gray in the country. What is the most serious zero-sum battle in America that you see today that needs attention?
I mean, I think one of the biggest divides that we don't actually talk about at all, and I would say this is across the aisle, is this question of poverty and economic security. We are in, if we talk about the State of the Union, we're in a crisis situation for, and by we I mean 140 million people. 140 million people are poor or low income, which means that they have insecure jobs, insecure housing, don't know if they're going to have food on their table or can afford diapers or utilities. And this is across the board, across race. It's, you know, it's up to 60% of our Black communities, 40% of our Asian communities, 64% of our Hispanic and Latino communities, and 1 out of every 3 or 66 million of white people and white people.
So you're saying the social
US.
contract is failing?
The social contract is failing. That's just one side. So the divide is that on the one side you have 140 million people and more who can't afford our basic needs. On the other, we have 3 people who own more wealth than half the country. And so this is one of the biggest divides that we need to put, you know, front and center. And this, you know, this crisis of poverty is, you know, is grounded in a crisis of systemic racism. It's grounded in and manifests in militarism and, you know, violence against our communities here and around the world. There's a war on the poor, and it translates into all these ecological crises that that our communities can't sustain.
Now, I've looked at homelessness, and one of the complaints the president has is that when he looks at San Francisco and he looks at places that have high degrees of homelessness, a lot of them in the West Coast, they tend to be in areas that are blue states. And if you look at the rates of homelessness in red states, it is less. What are the red states getting right that the blue states are getting wrong?
Well, I think this is, I mean, I think it goes back to this question of the policies that we're looking at and the policy violence that, that people are confronting. And I would actually take it back to not a question of red or blue, but what's the fundamental state of the economy and where is it meeting people's needs and where is it not meeting people's needs?
Well, the president, I think, would say we have 3.6% unemployment. We have the lowest levels of unemployment in the Black community and the Hispanic community across all communities. And to a certain degree, he's right. There's also a lagging underemployment figure out there, which often doesn't get discussed. But I just, not to put myself in the president's shoes, but he would say, hey, look at the stock market, look at unemployment, what's wrong?
Well, the stock market, you know, doesn't meet the needs of these 140 million and more. What, you know, the top 1% own more than half the stocks and mutual funds in the market. The bottom 90% only own 7% of the stock market. You can't live off of GDP. We live off of what we earn and what we're able to bring into our homes and our households. And unemployment, I mean, the unemployment rate, you know, for decades has been, for Black communities, has been twice as high as for white communities. This is a systemic problem, and the changes that we've seen in the economy and the labor market, you know, the traditional measure of unemployment doesn't capture all that. And so we have to look to the real unemployment rate, and that's consistently twice and above.
Yeah, I mean, when I listened to the President of the United States this week, and he's giving the State of the Union, he's going to point up in the gallery. Presidents do that. It's sort of a lesson and show and tell. You know, there's a veteran who did something heroic. Here's someone who was a business person who did something. I imagine he may not be pointing to someone who said, here's an impoverished person I haven't reached. But who, if you were to tell your story of what you think is important to the State of the Union, who should the president be pointing to and what?
I mean, that's going to be a hard one. I mean, last time he had Alice Johnson, right, to talk about criminal justice and sort of the inroads he's made.
I'm sure that'll come up.
Absolutely, it's going to come up. I mean, it was a Super Bowl ad on Sunday, so I think it absolutely is going to come up. And I think he's been making overtures to Blacks and other communities that he sees as not part of his constituent base, in part because he has a race issue. In particular, playing footsie with white supremacists is not a good way to sort of build your tent, right, and expand your base.
But isn't that a good step for the president to take?
I mean, if you think
you're not
that's going to be enough, no. I mean, Alice Johnson, I'm sure, has a transformative experience under this presidency, right? Like, that is a fact, to Dina's point. However, Alice Johnson is a person. She's not everybody. And I think when you think about what other things that people care about, in addition to, say, criminal justice reform, they also care about health care. They also care about what people see as sort of some ethical lapses in the ways we do immigration enforcement. So people care about a lot of things. And if you looked at the Black Women's Roundtable, one of the things that they found that Black women cared about was racism and sort of this trend, what they see as going back to the bad old days, right, of where we were, not even 40 and 50 years ago. So there's more on the table than just being able to point to that one person in the gallery and saying, hey, I've done great things for this one person, or this person is emblematic of my coalition. No, that's a person, and I don't think you can ignore the larger trends in terms of how people think about Donald Trump, how people see him, and how people read him. And I do agree with Dina that part of that is how do we have a discourse about facts?
That's right.
So everybody here.
Dina, how would you answer that?
Well, first I would.
On the facts
I would
issue.
say a couple of things about the one person. The First Step Act has actually given over 3,000 Americans freedom, and so
3,000 out of how many?
3,000. And I know, but this and it is called the First Step. 90% of those are African Americans, and so yes. It is 3,000 out of mass incarceration that we know our community gets the short end of that stick. But this president who has continued to be called a racist, is the one who delivered it, right? And so the issue and the question to him playing footsie with white supremacists, even PolitiFact has fact-checked this notion that we keep saying he hasn't denounced David Duke, he hasn't denounced the Spencer guy, he hasn't denounced people enough. PolitiFact says that he actually has denounced them, even 10 years, decades before.
You just Steve Bannon and other people in your administration, decades.
I mean, I want to ask this question sincerely, Dina. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think the bigger thing is the comment, particularly in Charlottesville, that they're very fine people
on both sides.
Yeah.
First of all, I will say that I think that was an impolitic thing. I don't think it made any sense. But if the idea is that, and this will outrage people, and it will probably outrage my sisters on this panel, but if you're going to say that there were people on the wrong side of that issue who were there because they didn't want Confederate statues to be torn down. So there were some people there who were there because they simply didn't want Confederate statues to be torn down. I personally haven't, I think, that's a fight that we can have a conversation about later. But there were very, very bad people who did very, very bad things. And then there were some people who got caught up in this thing that they were there to protest.
I don't believe that, though.
But let me ask so
characterization.
But let me ask
people
this.
know where these Confederate monuments come from. They know what they're about, and they knew who the sponsors were. So if you're there, say that. You can say whatever you want, but don't say, like, I didn't know, I just got caught up. You knew who the sponsors were. You knew coming down the pike that white supremacists had, if I'm giving the people the most charitable take that I can, which is that you knew that you cared about these Confederate statues. For some reason, you don't know, but you care about them. But you knew that this moment had been hijacked by these white supremacists. Yet you still showed up. And you didn't denounce it. And
I agree with you, and I will give you that. The people who were there because they were there for the Confederate statues, I believe that they should have made more noise about the bad things that happened, about not being there for the right reasons. But I will say this: I have no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, right? And this president, I promise you, if 13% increase in HBCUs, $300 million forgiven to 4 HBCUs.
For the audience, historically black colleges and
universities. There are things, and it's the selective outrage that, listen, understand this, and I make this to you, this commitment to you, my new friends and my sisters in the fight, right? On the right side of the aisle, I am going to plant my feet, and when this president, and when my party, I'm a conservative and I'm a Republican, and when my party does wrong, I will stand up and say so. And my only ask is that we not have selective outrage on the left. If this man is doing anything, one single thing that is good, let us say so. And when he does bad, let us say so. And I also say on the left, plant your feet.
Shall
That's right.
Let me ask you that's an interesting and brave statement.
Yeah.
If you were with various supporters on the left, supporting the communities and the poor, and the president made a genuine and authentic gesture that helped move that needle forward. Is that the kind of thing you could embrace and applaud?
I mean, this is not, in its core about left or right, but about right and wrong. And I applaud this, this appeal to look at the broad, measures that are being taken and that aren't being taken. If we include that, and if we want to talk about, racism and systemic racism, we need to talk about voter suppression, what's been happening, because voter suppression is a way that, that we're actually in a worse situation today than we were 50 years ago when the Civil Rights Act was passed, in terms of attacks on the right to vote. There are, since in the past number of years, there have been 26 states that have passed voter suppression
Shelby
laws.
County v. Holder. So
Shelby County v. Holder. And so, and since that time, millions of people have been purged from the rolls. Polling places have been closed. This is a systemic attack and deliberately disorganizing people, including people of color, to then bring in, especially people of color, especially black voters, to come in and then implement a set of policies that affects the broad range of the poor. And so we need to talk about voter suppression. We need to talk about actually what's happening with our military. If we want to talk the full range of activities, what's happening with
the
military? What happens when 53% of our federal discretionary dollars go to the military and only 15 cents to anti-poverty programs? We can't talk about one without talking about the other. When we're willing to spend $750 billion on the military and not willing to spend 1/1000 of that on having automatic voter registration, that's the
Well, that's what I think is interesting about this
time,
time, because the president is going to come out and say, hey, I'm doing a good job. Look at the numbers. Look at what we've done. But how do you, Niambi, how do you reset in this environment? I was with Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, earlier this week, and talking about McDowell County, West Virginia, one of the poorest counties in the United States, and their efforts to try to create alternative pathways for potential success for these kids in these schools in a really isolated place. A lot of poverty, lots of opioid tragedies in that area, and it's just sort of a problem area that's trying to find its strengths and be connected. How do we move forward in a way, and do you think the president tonight is going to have any insights into how to move forward for those people in places like McDowell County?
Yeah, I mean, and I take Gina's point well, like giving the person a applause when they deserve it. And I think he will talk about some of those things. So I think he's going to talk about things like school choice, which probably folks in McDowell County would like, and perhaps offering ways for expanding school choice so that people can create space for alternative ways of learning, particularly as we talk about job training and the need for having people with skilled trades, for example, as thinking about what the future of the workforce is going to look like. So I think he'll probably will talk about things like that. I think he also will talk about healthcare, because part of the issue for folks in isolated places like McDowell County, West Virginia, or Warren County, North Carolina, is access to health care.
Right.
And that is regardless of whether they have just health insurance, but where are medical clinics located? Where does one go and get, say, expanded services like mental health services?
Right, it's retracting. I mean, just for those watching, the retraction of health services in rural America.
Farther and farther away. And when you're talking about things like opioid abuse, for example, which is a symptom not just of people in pain physically, but people in pain emotionally and mentally. Right. And these are the places that we have forgotten. I think he's probably going to talk about some of that, right, and talk about how he is going to assist
part of it, I
these
think,
folks
let's look at the other side of the
place.
equation for a minute. Maybe, Dina, you can help us with this, is that part of the equation is that you lower taxes, you got a big tax cut, particularly a big corporate tax cut, right? Is there a case, if you get the GDP going higher, if you get growth rate coming in here, is it an exercise where there's a trickle down to others in society? Dina?
You know, I actually think that we do see a greater investment in underserved, low-income, brown and black communities when we lower corporate tax rates. I also think that when we look at things like opportunity zones, where there are 9,000 designations as opportunity zones, where rich people are going to be rich, but now there's an incentive for rich people to invest in poor communities. You know, I think something like, and you know, I think that there are over 9,000 opportunity zones. Something like maybe 30 million people in those communities. So, and when we talk about this idea of 140 million poor and low,
so the opportunity zones are where rich people can basically invest money. They get a tax, tax relief for that. And a lot of people look at that as sort of, you know, bribing, you know, folks to go in.
You know what? And if my whole thing is this is you know, this is what I believe. I do believe rich people are going to keep getting rich. I really do. And but if there's a way for rich people to use their wealth and invest in communities that usually look like my family, then you know,
Well,
I'm all for it. But let me say this really quickly about the 140 million poor. Now, my question though is, and I ask this in full dialogue and sincerity. So if we see that we've been fighting a war on poverty for 50 plus years, we've spent over $20 trillion on this war on poverty. If we had just taken that money, divided it up, and given it to the poor people, I think we would be in better shape than we are now. But we are not in better shape. So to me, like, I see free markets and fair markets and creating opportunities for people like me to be in business and to create legacy wealth for my family. I see those as.
And do you see it moving the needle? Do you see any real trickle down to those communities, or at least buy-in, or pathways?
I see buy-in. I don't think with opportunity zones and those things, we haven't had time to see the results of them. But I do see, like, and you raised the question, these communities where there is success, they do seem to be in red communities rather than blue, and I don't want to paint it that way. But my question is, what are the policies? Like, I've not heard articulated from not one of the Democratic presidential candidates how they will pay for these policies that they say will improve lives. And to me, it looks very much like LBJ, Great Society kind of things that don't actually change lives.
Well, can I take that for a minute? The war on poverty, programs within that war on poverty were very successful. And then they were defunded for what? For war? And they were defunded for policies that then were oriented around the rich. And that's what we're seeing, actually. These opportunity zones are policies that have the interest of, that when we look at Head Start, the expansion of health care, the expansion of Social Security programs, these were successes that have actually continued to lift some people up, but they have continued to be defunded, and the percentage of the federal budget that goes towards these programs is consistently cut back. And I would also say that...
I think even Donald Trump has said that spending a couple of $1 trillion on endless wars has undermined the country, right? I mean, I think the president has said those things.
I don't think anyone supports endless wars. Yeah. I guess when I see the poverty, the single family rate in black communities go from 20% in the 60s to over 75% today, to me, that creates a social structure that only creates poverty. And I think it's the Brookings Institute. It's actually something that Dr. Carson often talks about, this idea, like, if we know that there's
This is Ben Carson, who's Secretary for Housing and Urban Development.
Exactly. And Dr. Ben Carson cites a Brookings Institute study that talks about 3 things that we can do to alleviate poverty. We know that it'll bring it to 2%. If you graduate from high school, you wait to get married, and you get married and you wait until you're married to have children. If you do those 3 things in that order, then those are policies. Like,
marriage is not a policy.
Our last couple of minutes,
but it should, like, codify. Like, how do we, if we know that these things work, then how do we build that into policy?
Yeah. Well, I think what you're suggesting is actually a very dangerous policy, because it's suggesting that marriage is a short end run around poverty, and we know that doesn't happen, particularly if we know what rates of intermarriage are, particularly for people of class status. So you're just going to replicate poverty, but you'll replicate it in a two-parent household.
Thank you. We're like right near the end. I'm going to just ask Naomi, let me start just 30 seconds on what you most want to hear in this speech tonight that would give you hope.
I could just say this. There's not much that I think is going to be said here, but if he talked about something as basic as infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, that would actually be something I would care about, because I live in this area. I live in this Northeast corridor. Train travel is terrible. Metro service is terrible.
And transportation is a way you can reinvent
absolutely.
communities.
And we could talk about highway funding and redoing bridges.
Shally, what needs to be in the speech for you?
We need to talk about how this is going to be a fair and full election that everyone who is able to vote can participate in, and we need to take on this war on the poor. We can't be, as we've been talking about, we can't be blaming the poor for poverty, their poverty. We got to make this a systemic solution. We just got to have systemic conversations and fight poverty.
Dean, I'm going to give you the last word. What should be in the speech?
I would like for the president to stay on message and take credit for a booming economy. And I think that when you compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, this president's economy is better than Obama and Bush 45. So.
With that, I want to thank you for such a rich conversation. I want to watch the speech with all of you tonight. Don't know if we'll get the chance for that, but I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Howard University Assistant Professor Nyambi Carter, Republican strategist Dina Bass-Williams, and social justice activist Shally Gupta-Barnes. Thank you all very much. I really learned a lot from the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Some Americans believe the economy has never been better, and some see it as a stacked deck against America's middle class and poor. Some are appalled by America's treatment of migrants and refugees, and some are actually applauding the nightmare at the borders. As Dina on my panel said, Americans are so divided they can't agree on whether they're doing well or badly. My guests didn't agree with each other, but they listened to each other. They said they want unity and less divisiveness. Wouldn't it be nice if words like that came from the president? Donald Trump has not made solving health care or infrastructure or education or climate change unifying themes in the nation. He has used these policies to divide citizens, and that will likely not change. And that, unfortunately, is the bottom line.